Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy Stories channel. Here you will find peace, comfort, and stories that will help you leave the worries of the day behind. Make yourself comfortable, relax, close your eyes, and let the words transport you to a world of peace and dreams. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it so that you always have a new story at hand for a peaceful sleep. And now, let's begin. Imagine yourself stepping into the warm glow of an Athenian evening. The streets outside are noisy with vendors and gossip. But once you cross the threshold of the andron, the men's quarter of a wealthy citizen's home, you enter another world entirely. Oil lamps cast a golden shimmer against plastered walls painted with mythic scenes. Garlands of ivy and roses perfume the air, and the faint strum of a lyre sets the rhythm for the night ahead. This wasn't just a casual drinking hangout. The symposia was ritual, theater, and intellectual combat all rolled into one. Guests did not simply stroll in. They prepared for hours, washing, anointing themselves with fragrant oils, arranging their hair, and even choosing wreaths of myrtle or violets to crown their heads. Appearance mattered. Every detail announced status. When you reclined on the couch, you weren't just drinking wine. You were performing your role in a drama of wit, elegance, and reputation. The layout of the andron itself reflected hierarchy. Couches called kleini were arranged in a horseshoe around a central mixing bowl, the great crater. The position of each guest was a subtle signal of rank and honor, determined by the host. At one end of the room, the musicians or entertainers would be stationed, ready to play flutes, recite Homeric verses, or perform dances that blurred the line between art and seduction. The host, always male, always someone with enough wealth to put on a display, set the tone. Some symposia were dignified affairs, where philosophy, poetry, and debate carried the evening. These could feel like a lecture hall drenched in wine, where guests sparred with words sharper than swords. Other nights, however, things veered toward chaos. With too much drink and too many egos in the room, insults were hurled, couches overturned, and the noble symposium dissolved into drunken brawls. But whatever the mood, one truth held firm. The symposia was never about wine alone. It was about community and competition. Every guest sought to impress, whether with clever lines of poetry, biting humor, or simply how gracefully he drained his cup. To be invited was an honor. To perform well was a chance at fame. To fail meant ridicule. In this charged atmosphere, the symposium became a mirror of Athenian society itself, brilliant, messy, competitive, and endlessly human. Once the guests had settled into their couches, crowned with garlands and perfumed with oils, the heart of the symposium revealed itself, the wine. But this wasn't a matter of simply popping open a jug and passing it around. For the Athenians, how you mixed your wine was as important as the wine itself. Drinking unmixed wine straight from the jar was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized Thracians or desperate drunkards would do. True Greek sophistication demanded balance. At the center of the andron sat the crater, a massive mixing bowl, often as tall as a man's waist, decorated with mythological scenes of Dionysus, the god of wine, and his riotous followers. Into this vessel, servants poured rich, dark wine from amphorae, followed by water drawn from the household well.
The precise ratio of wine to water became the evening's first decision. Should the mixture be 3 parts water to 1 part wine, ensuring a gentle buzz and witty conversation, or 2 to 1, risking a more spirited, rowdy night? Rarely was it equal parts, for that level of potency could unleash bedlam before the evening had even begun. The responsibility for this decision lay in the symposiarch, the master of the feast. Chosen either by lot or appointed by the host, the symposiarch's job was both enviable and perilous. He was part referee, part dictator of pleasure. Too weak a mix, and guests would complain that the night was dull. Too strong, and the couches might turn into battlegrounds before the musicians even played their first notes. To govern the measure of intoxication was, in a way, to govern the flow of the night itself. Once mixed, the wine was ladled into individual jugs and poured into kylix, broad, shallow cups with delicate handles. These cups were more than functional. Many were painted with playful or scandalous images at the bottom. A satyr in mid-dance, a drunken reveler tumbling head first, or a god raising his cup would only appear once the drinker had drained his own cup. In this way, the very act of finishing your wine became entertainment, a small surprise waiting at the bottom of the bowl. Thus, before a single toast was raised, the stage was set. The wine was not just drink, it was a carefully measured companion, coaxing the evening toward philosophy or chaos, depending on the will of the symposiarch. Balance was the key, and in Athens, balance was everything. With the couches filled and the wine flowing, the true spirit of the symposium began to unfold: conversation. For Athenians, drinking was never just about dulling the senses. The goal was stimulation, of wit, of debate, of memory. Guests reclined side by side, kylix in hand, and launched into topics ranging from the sublime to the scandalous. Sometimes the conversation began lightly. A guest might recite a witty line of poetry, quote Homer, or challenge another to complete a riddle. Others would compete in telling stories of love affairs, military campaigns, or political gossip. Laughter was frequent, but so was sharpness. Athenians prized logos, the art of persuasive speech, and no symposium was complete without verbal sparring. A well-placed insult delivered with elegance could earn applause louder than any song. On more serious gatherings, philosophy took center stage. These symposia became miniature academies where men tested ideas under the influence of Dionysus. Questions floated in the smoky lamplight. What is love? What is justice? Does the soul survive after death? It was in such settings that figures like Socrates, Alcibiades, and Plato made their mark. Plato's Symposium, one of the most famous texts in philosophy, is itself a record of a drinking party where each guest gave a speech on the nature of love. Beneath the ivy crowns and wine-drenched banter, the foundations of Western thought were being laid.
But even the deepest philosophy was not divorced from competition. Each guest sought to impress, not just with wisdom, but with style. A clever analogy, a daring argument, or a perfectly timed joke might win the night. In this way, conversation was a contest as much as a collaboration, a verbal duel with wine as the fuel. Still, conversation at the symposium could just as easily veer into scandal. Political intrigue was a common topic, as were tales of adultery, betrayal, and corruption. Some evenings became less about lofty ideas and more about tearing reputations to shreds. After all, wine loosened tongues, and in a society where reputation was everything, What was whispered at a symposium could echo loudly in the streets of Athens the next day. Thus, conversation at the symposium was never neutral. It was play and performance, philosophy and politics, laughter and danger. One moment you might find yourself debating the nature of the soul, and the next you could be defending your honor from a sly remark about your latest affair. This was the power of the symposium. Every word, like every sip of wine, carried weight. As the wine mellowed, tongues and conversations grew more animated. The air filled with another essential element of the symposium: music. No gathering was complete without it. Once the first cups had been drained, hired musicians, usually young women or enslaved performers, entered carrying their instruments. The haunting double pipes of the aulos, the plucked strings of the kithara or lyre, and sometimes drums that beat softly in rhythm with the rising voices. The aulos in particular had a hypnotic effect. Its sound was sharp, almost piercing, designed not for quiet meditation, but to rouse the senses. Plato himself distrusted its intoxicating tones, believing it encouraged excess. But for most Athenians, that was precisely the point. As the flutes whined and the strings thrummed, men reclined deeper into their couches, carried along on waves of melody and wine. Entertainment at symposia was varied and unpredictable. Some nights, poets were invited to recite verses of Homer or compose impromptu couplets on themes chosen by the guests. Other nights, dancers performed, sometimes acrobatic, sometimes sensual, always meant to hold the gaze of a half-drunken audience. Courtesans, too, were common presences, blending conversation with seduction, their laughter punctuating the rhythm of the music. Yet music at a symposium was never passive background noise. It became woven into the rituals of drinking. Guests often engaged in scholia, improvised drinking songs passed around the circle like a verbal game. One man would sing a line, often humorous or provocative, and the next was challenged to respond with a verse of equal wit. To falter was embarrassing. To shine meant glory in the eyes of peers. In this way, the music became a contest of cleverness, just as conversation had been. Even the cups themselves joined the fun. Some kailikas were painted with musical scenes, so that as a guest drank, a hidden flute player or dancing satyr appeared at the bottom. Draining your wine revealed not just the painted image, but often a round of applause, laughter, or a bawdy joke from the others. Still, music carried more than entertainment. It touched on the divine. To the Greeks, music was linked to cosmic harmony, a reminder of Dionysus and Apollo alike, the god of frenzy and the god of order. At the symposium, that tension was alive. The flute might push men toward frenzy, while the lyre sought to steady their hearts. Between the two, balance, or chaos, was struck. Once the music had loosened the air and conversation had taken its course, the symposium often shifted into another beloved pastime: games. Wine did not only fuel philosophy and poetry, it also sharpened the thrill of competition. And in Athens, where nearly everything was a contest, the symposium was no exception. One of the most popular games was kotabos. The rules were simple, yet it required finesse. A guest would swirl the dregs of his wine in a kylix, then fling them across the room with a flick of the wrist, aiming at a target, often a bronze disc balanced on a stand. If the wine struck true, the disc clanged loudly. The sound met with cheers and laughter. But a sloppy throw, splattering the wall or another guest, could earn ridicule for the rest of the evening. The game was more than play. It was a test of grace and precision, a chance to show control even in drunkenness. Other contests were more direct. Who could drain a cup the fastest?
who could remain the most eloquent while visibly staggering from wine. Some symposia delighted in pushing their guests to the edge of excess, decreeing rounds of increasingly potent mixtures. Others favored skill over endurance, devising intellectual or poetic challenges between drinks. Either way, the spirit of agon, struggle, and competition was always present. There were also games of wit, which blended seamlessly with conversation. Guests might challenge each other to invent verses on the spot, insult each other in rhyme, or respond to riddles crafted to expose quickness of mind. These contests blurred the line between play and performance, between joke and humiliation. To win was to bask in laughter and admiration. To fail meant enduring the sharp-tongued mockery of peers. Yet contests were not always so light-hearted. When politics or personal rivalry simmered beneath the surface, a drinking game could turn ugly. A spill, an insult hidden in a verse, or a failed boast might escalate quickly. What began as a playful challenge could end in fists, broken cups, and blood on the floor. Dionysus, after all, was a god of frenzy as much as joy, and the symposium constantly balanced between order and chaos. Thus, the games of the symposium were never merely diversions. They were miniature dramas in themselves, moments where wine tested not only the body, but the reputation of each guest. Every throw, every song, every boast was a chance at triumph or humiliation under the watchful eyes of friends, rivals, and Dionysus.
If wine was the lifeblood of the symposium, then love and desire were its restless spirit. No gathering was free from the presence, or at least the discussion, of eros. Courtesans, musicians, and dancers often drifted among the couches, not just as entertainers, but as participants in the atmosphere of flirtation and seduction. The symposium blurred the lines between the intellectual and the erotic, between philosophy and passion. For many guests, courtesans were more than ornaments. Known as hetairae, they were women trained in wit, conversation, and charm, capable of holding their own in dialogue with philosophers as easily as they could captivate with music or dance. Unlike ordinary prostitutes, hetairae had reputations, sometimes commanding great respect and influence. A clever remark from a hetairae could shape the flow of discussion or reduce a boastful guest to silence. They were both admired companions and social mirrors, reminding men that eloquence was not theirs alone. Yet, the symposium was also a place where male desire, especially for youths, was openly discussed. In Athenian culture, relationships between older men and younger male companions carried layers of mentorship, affection, and sexuality. At the symposium, these relationships were flaunted, teased, and celebrated through speeches and jokes. The line between noble praise of beauty and drunken scandal was always thin, and many evenings teetered on both sides of it. Philosophical discussions often wove love into their themes. Plato's Symposium immortalizes one such evening where each guest offered a speech on the nature of eros. Some praised love as the force binding the cosmos. Others mocked it as a dangerous madness. Socrates famously claimed that true love was not about flesh at all, but about ascending toward the divine and eternal. Yet, even as lofty words filled the air, the reality of the symposium was far more physical. Laughter, stolen kisses, whispered propositions in the corner of the room. Desire at the symposium was not always gentle. Jealousy, rivalry, and wounded pride often lurked beneath the wreaths and perfumes. A courtesan's favor could spark competition between guests, and a cutting remark about one's beauty, or lack thereof, could ignite more than words. In such moments, the symposium revealed its raw truth. Beneath the philosophy and poetry, it was a crucible of human longing, fragile egos, and the unpredictable power of attraction. Thus, desire at the symposium was never a mere sideshow. It was the pulse of the evening, binding conversation, music, and wine into something far more volatile, a mixture of charm, danger, and revelation. Beneath the ivy crowns, the music, and the sweet haze of wine, the symposium often became a theater for politics. In Athens, where democracy demanded constant debate, even leisure could not escape the pull of power. Reclining on their couches, men let their tongues wander into dangerous territory, boasting of alliances, whispering conspiracies, or tearing apart rivals who were not present to defend themselves. The wine loosened tongues that daytime restraint kept bound. One guest might boast of his military service, painting himself as indispensable to the city's defense. Another would counter with sly remarks about corruption, hinting at bribes taken in the assembly or the law courts. A man might praise Pericles or Alcibiades or another political leader of the day, only for someone else to remind the room of their scandals, affairs, or disastrous campaigns. And scandal was never far. The symposium was fertile ground for gossip. Who had seduced whose wife? Who had cheated on debts? Who had been caught in disgraceful behavior at a festival? The more wine flowed, the sharper the accusations became. Witty barbs that began as jokes could shift into daggers. To be ridiculed in such a setting was humiliating, but to win the crowd's laughter at another man's expense could be a kind of political victory. The risks of such talk were real. The symposium was private, but words spoken in its smoky glow had a way of echoing in the daylight streets. Alcibiades himself, brilliant, scandalous, and reckless, was infamous for drunken boasts at symposia, some of which haunted him in trials later. What was said half-jokingly over wine could return as evidence of treachery, impiety, or conspiracy. Yet men returned to these conversations again and again, because scandal was irresistible. To hear secrets whispered, to watch a rival squirm, to strike a verbal blow disguised as comedy. All of this gave the symposium its edge. It was not only philosophy and poetry that drew Athenians to these parties, but also the thrill of seeing masks slip, of reputations crumbling under laughter and mockery. Thus, politics at the symposium was both entertainment and danger. It mirrored Athenian democracy itself, messy, loud, competitive, and filled with ego. The symposium may have been private, but it was never separate from the city. In the haze of wine and song, the seeds of political triumph or ruin were often planted. As the hours passed and the crater was refilled again and again, the carefully measured balance of the symposium began to wobble. What had started as polished conversation, witty songs, and disciplined games often gave way to slurred speech, unsteady gestures, and eruptions of unrestrained emotion. Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, made his presence felt most vividly in these late stages. The line between philosophy and madness blurred. Guests who once quoted Homer with elegance might now shout half-finished verses, their words dissolving into laughter. Others, overcome with wine, grew bold in ways the sober daylight never allowed, confessing forbidden loves, insulting powerful men, or making boasts too wild to be believed. The symposiarch might still attempt to impose order, decreeing another round or demanding a song, but more often than not, he too had surrendered to intoxication. Physical chaos was common. Cups were overturned, wreaths slid askew, and couches became battlegrounds. A careless remark could spark a heated argument.
An argument could escalate into thrown cups or fists. Servants scurried nervously, trying to clean up spills or calm tempers before matters grew violent. And yet, for many, this dissent was part of the allure. The symposium was never meant to remain perfectly civilized. It was a controlled dive into the unpredictable realm of Dionysus. Sometimes the chaos spilled beyond the walls of the andron. A drunken band of revelers called a komos might stagger into the streets singing bawdy songs, banging on neighbors' doors and carrying torches through the night. These street parades were both feared and admired, rowdy, disruptive, but also a recognized part of Dionysian culture. To lead or participate in a komos was to wear one's drunkenness as a badge of honor. Of course, not every descent ended in laughter. Some nights brought real danger. A rivalry reignited, an insult too sharp, or a boast too threatening could end with blades drawn. The Athenians themselves acknowledged this risk. Too much wine could transform a symposium from a gathering of equals into a brawl of enemies. Yet even in its disorder, the symposium had meaning. To surrender to chaos was to embrace the god of ecstasy, to taste freedom from the rigid order of daily civic life. The descent into frenzy was both a warning and a revelation. Beneath the masks of philosophy and poetry, men were still creatures of passion, pride, and excess. By the time the oil lamps guttered low and the last notes of the flute faded, the symposium had usually run its course. Guests staggered from the andron, ivy wreaths askew, their robes stained with wine, voices hoarse from song and argument. Some collapsed into sleep on couches, unable to rise until daylight, while others spilled into the streets to join a komos, their drunken parade echoing through Athens until dawn. The morning after was rarely graceful. Servants were left to scrub floors sticky with spilled wine, gather shattered kylix, and dispose of wreaths wilted in the night's heat. For the participants, the aftermath carried both pride and regret. A sharp remark made too freely under Dionysus' spell might become the subject of gossip at the agora the next day. A boast could haunt a man in court or politics. Yet the same symposium might also forge new friendships, strengthen bonds of loyalty, or cement reputations for wit and brilliance. To shine at a symposium was to elevate oneself socially, even politically. To disgrace oneself was to risk ridicule far beyond the walls of the host's home. But the symposium was more than a night of excess. It was a cultural institution. It reflected the very character of Athens: competitive, intellectual, chaotic, and creative. In the balance between wine and water, between philosophy and scandal, Athenians tested the limits of themselves and their society. The greatest ideas of Greek thought, discussions of love, justice, and the soul, were not born in classrooms, but in wine-soaked gatherings where laughter and argument mingled. Plato's Symposium immortalized this truth, showing how an evening of drinking could become a meditation on the nature of Eros itself. Even after Athens' golden age faded, the spirit of the Symposium lived on. Later Romans adapted it into their convivia, while echoes of it resurface in medieval banquets, Renaissance salons, and even the modern dinner party. Wherever people gathered to drink, to argue, to sing, and to confess too much under the influence of alcohol, the shadow of the symposium lingers. The morning after may have left Athenians blurred-eyed, their reputations dented, their heads heavy, but the memory of the symposium endured. It was never just about the wine. It was about being human, brilliant and foolish, disciplined and chaotic, philosophical and scandalous, all in the same night. In that way, the symposium was Athens itself, distilled into a single room, a single bowl of wine, and a single unforgettable evening. Imagine standing in the dust of a battlefield, the sun blazing overhead, and hearing a sound unlike anything you've ever known. A deep, trumpeting roar that shakes the earth beneath your sandals. For a Roman soldier, this was no ordinary noise. It was the battle cry of Carthage's most fearsome weapon, the war elephant.
These creatures were living towers, taller than any horse, covered in armor with tusks capped in iron, and bodies capable of flattening a line of men in seconds. To those seeing them for the first time, they might as well have been mythical beasts, closer to the monsters of Homer than to anything born of this world. The Carthaginians had turned elephants into symbols of power and terror. Imported from Africa, most were the now extinct North African forest elephants, smaller than the massive Indian variety, but still terrifying when outfitted for war. They were dressed in protective armor, with spiked or bladed tusks that transformed their natural bulk into a crushing weapon. Some even carried wooden towers strapped to their backs, holding archers and spearmen who could rain down death from above. The psychological effect of these animals was as important as their physical strength. Horses panicked at their smell, men froze at their sheer size and the sight of an elephant charging. A wall of flesh and metal thundering forward was enough to shatter morale before a single blow landed. This was Carthage's advantage, to terrify the enemy into breaking ranks, turning discipline into chaos. But war elephants were more than weapons. They were statements. Marching into battle with elephants declared that Carthage was not mere a city-state. It was a superpower, capable of commanding nature itself. When generals like Hamilcar or Hannibal deployed them, the message was clear: you were not just fighting soldiers, you were fighting gods of war made flesh. Still, the Romans quickly realized these beasts were not invincible. Their size made them slow, their behavior unpredictable. But in this opening moment, before tactics, before countermeasures, before men adapted, the war elephant stood as the most terrifying shock force of the ancient world. They were not simply animals. They were a roar in the dust, a living nightmare, and for Carthage, a weapon meant to crush the will of Rome.
Carthage didn't simply unleash untamed giants onto the battlefield. It carefully trained them to become extensions of its army. Captured in the forests and plains of North Africa, young elephants were brought into camps where specialized handlers called mahads began the long process of shaping their behavior. These men lived almost every moment beside the animals, feeding them, grooming them, and most importantly, teaching them to obey commands in the chaos of battle. Training an elephant was equal parts discipline and trust. The mahat guided the animal with vocal calls, prods, and even iron hooks, conditioning it to respond instantly. Elephants learned to march in formation, halt at signals, and charge on command. They were acclimated to the sounds of war, the clash of bronze, the blare of trumpets, the screams of soldiers. Fires were sometimes lit near their pens, so the beasts grew accustomed to smoke and shouting. The goal was simple: make sure that when the elephant faced the madness of battle, it did not panic and turn against its own side. Armor added another layer of preparation. Craftsmen fitted elephants with bronze or leather headpieces, chest plates, and tusk sheaths tipped with sharp blades or spikes. These modifications transformed the already fearsome creatures into juggernauts. On their backs, wooden towers known as howdahs were secured with ropes and straps, carrying 2 to 4 soldiers armed with javelins, bows, or long spears. In this way, each elephant became a mobile fortress, both shock weapon and elevated firing platform. But the most important training was psychological. Mahats taught elephants to channel their aggression outward. They were driven to frenzy before battle, sometimes by being given wine or being pricked with sharp objects, ensuring they entered the fight already worked into a rage. Once unleashed, they could trample infantry lines, scatter cavalry, and crush fortifications. Of course, the risks were immense. No matter how well trained, an elephant was still a wild animal.
If injured or terrified, it might turn back and rampage through its own army, causing as much destruction to friend as to foe. Carthaginian generals understood this gamble, but they also understood the payoff. When properly handled, war elephants were more than beasts. They were terror made flesh. The first shock wave in a battle plan meant to unnerve and overwhelm Rome before swords even clashed. The first appearances of Carthage's war elephants stunned enemies across the Mediterranean. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, when Carthage fought its rivals in Sicily, North Africa, and Iberia, elephants quickly became its signature weapon against lightly armored infantry or cavalry unused to such beasts. Their effect was devastating. Imagine a Greek hoplite phalanx, trained to hold the line against men, suddenly confronted with an animal weighing several tons, trumpeting, charging, and crushing everything in its path. Spears splintered, shields were knocked aside, and horses bolted in terror. One of the earliest documented uses was during Carthage's campaigns in Sicily against Greek city-states. Here, the elephants were unleashed to break through heavily defended positions, scattering men before them and leaving gaps that Carthaginian infantry could exploit. They were not merely weapons of destruction, but tools of strategy, softening up an enemy line before the decisive clash. Their appearance became so iconic that Greek writers often described them with awe, comparing them to living siege engines. In North Africa, elephants were equally effective against rebellious tribes or rival armies unfamiliar with the beasts. They instilled instant fear. Even when they didn't kill in large numbers, the psychological shock of their presence often decided battles before they truly began. Enemies sometimes fled at the mere sight of them, unwilling to test their courage against these colossal adversaries. Yet the early successes also revealed their limitations. In narrow terrain, elephants could be trapped or avoided. Clever opponents set ambushes, targeting the mahots or wounding the animals until they panicked. But when deployed on open fields where there was space to charge, they were nearly unstoppable. Carthage, learning quickly, began to shape its battlefield tactics around their use, combining elephants with disciplined infantry and swift cavalry to create a combined arms strategy that few enemies could match. These early successes cemented elephants as more than just exotic beasts. They became symbols of Carthaginian power. Other nations might have strong infantry or swift cavalry, but only Carthage had elephants, and that gave them a terrifying edge. For Rome, watching these encounters from across the sea, the message was clear. One day they too would face these living towers, and when that day came, no amount of drill or discipline could prepare them for the shock of a charging elephant line. No story of Carthaginian elephants is more legendary than Hannibal's audacious march across the Alps during the Second Punic War. In 218 BC, Hannibal set out to strike at the very heart of Rome, not by sailing across the Mediterranean, but by leading his army, infantry, cavalry, and elephants over the treacherous mountain passes of Gaul and into Italy. It was a gamble so outrageous that even today it feels closer to myth than history. The elephants, around 37 in number, were not just animals in this march, they were symbols of defiance. To Hannibal, they were meant to terrify the Romans before a single spear was thrown. Imagine the spectacle. Colossal beasts trudging through icy paths, their bulk silhouetted against snow-covered peaks, drivers urging them forward as avalanches thundered in the distance. For the soldiers alongside them, exhausted and freezing, the elephants were proof of their commander's iron will. If these creatures could endure the climb, so could men. But the journey was brutal. Narrow trails barely wide enough for men had to be hacked open for the elephants. Slippery slopes threatened to send them plummeting into ravines. The cold was relentless. Beasts used to African heat shivered in the mountain winds, their trunks raised helplessly against the snow. Food was scarce, and keeping such massive animals fed and watered was a near impossible task. Some elephants perished on the journey, collapsing from exhaustion or tumbling to their deaths. Yet many survived. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, the sight of elephants emerging from the mountains shocked the Roman world.
These were not just soldiers arriving on their border, but monsters of war carried over landscapes the Romans had believed impossible. The psychological impact was enormous. News spread like wildfire. Hannibal had brought living fortresses into Italy itself. Though the march had cost Carthage dearly, the symbolism was worth its weight in gold. The elephants were proof of Hannibal's genius, his willingness to do what no other commander dared. They did not simply arrive as weapons, they arrived as omens. Rome now faced not just an enemy army, but one led by a man who could bend nature itself to his will. In December 218 BC, Hannibal's gamble with the Alps bore fruit at the Battle of Trebia, his first major clash with Roman forces on Italian soil. After weeks of maneuvering, he finally lured the Romans into open battle near the Trebia River in northern Italy. Exhausted, half-frozen, and hungry from crossing the icy waters at dawn, the Roman legions found themselves facing not only Hannibal's disciplined army, but also his surviving war elephants. Though their numbers had dwindled since the Alpine crossing, the elephants still played a decisive psychological role. Stationed on Hannibal's flanks, the beasts became walls of flesh, towering over Roman cavalry. At the signal they charged, trumpeting, tusks glinting with metal caps, trampling forward as archers atop their backs rained missiles into enemy ranks. For many Roman soldiers, this was their first direct encounter with elephants, and panic rippled through the lines. Horses bolted at the smell and sound of the animals, throwing cavalry units into chaos before they could even engage. The Romans tried to counter with discipline, bracing shields and thrusting spears upward. Some elephants fell under the barrage, pierced and maddened, but even in death they sowed destruction, collapsing onto soldiers, crushing shields and men alike. Those that survived rampaged unpredictably, scattering formations that relied on tight cohesion. Once the lines were fractured, Hannibal unleashed his cavalry and hidden reserves, surrounding the disoriented Romans and cutting them to pieces. Though the elephants were not the primary killers, their impact was undeniable. They destabilized the battlefield, turning Roman order into confusion, softening the enemy just long enough for Hannibal's tactical genius to deliver the decisive blow. Ancient sources note that after Trebia, the Romans were left shaken, not only by defeat, but by the memory of those colossal beasts roaring through their lines. The image of elephants crushing soldiers into the frozen mud lingered long after the battle ended. But the victory came at a cost. The harsh Italian winter and lack of fodder proved disastrous for Hannibal's elephants. Most of the animals that had terrified Rome at Trebia soon perished in the cold months that followed, leaving him with only one survivor by spring. A massive creature remembered by the Carthaginians as Suras, meaning the Syrian. Whether the name referred to his breed, his origins, or simply his appearance is debated. But Suras became more than an animal. He was a symbol of Hannibal's resilience and defiance in the heart of enemy territory. Suras was said to have been the largest and most imposing of the herd, possibly a war elephant of Syrian or Indian stock, acquired through trade rather than the smaller North African species. His sheer size and endurance set him apart. Roman sources claim that Hannibal even used Suras as a kind of battlefield platform. With his vision failing from an eye disease, the general supposedly directed armies while perched on Suras's back, shaded beneath a canopy and elevated above the chaos. Whether this detail is fact or legend, it underscores the deep impression the elephant left on contemporaries. On the battlefield, Suras carried more than just Hannibal. He carried morale. For the Carthaginian soldiers who had endured the horrors of the Alps, his survival was proof that their cause was favored by the gods.
To the Romans, he was a living reminder of the terror at Trebia, a hulking shadow of Hannibal's earlier victories. Even alone, he amplified the aura of Carthage's commander, transforming him into a figure who seemed untouchable, larger than life. But despite Surus's symbolic power, he was still only one elephant. As Hannibal advanced deeper into Italy, fighting at Lake Trasmene and eventually Cannae, elephants no longer played the decisive role they once had. The Italian climate, the lack of proper fodder, and the relentless pace of campaigning made it almost impossible to keep such beasts alive in the long term. Surus, though beloved, could not reverse that reality. Eventually, even his legend faded into uncertainty. Sources fall silent on when or how he died, but his story lived on as the emblem of Hannibal's daring. While Rome adapted and developed strategies to neutralize elephants, Surus remained the haunting memory of their first devastating encounters. In many ways, he was not just Hannibal's last elephant in Italy, he was the last echo of Carthage's boldest gamble to terrify Rome into submission. At first, Rome had no idea how to fight elephants. Legionaries trained to face men with swords and spears suddenly found themselves staring down charging towers of muscle and ivory. Their initial instinct was to panic, and Hannibal exploited that fear brilliantly. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. By the later years of the Second Punic War, Roman commanders had developed clever countermeasures that transformed the elephant from a weapon of terror to a liability. One of the simplest tactics was to open lanes in the legion's formation. When elephants charged, instead of holding a solid line, Roman soldiers stepped aside, creating corridors that funneled the beasts harmlessly through the ranks.
Once past, the elephants could be harassed with javelins and slings until they either collapsed or fled. The key was discipline, resisting the urge to scatter and instead turning chaos into controlled maneuver. Roman missile troops also became crucial. Velites, lightly armed skirmishers, were trained to target elephants specifically. They hurled spears at sensitive points, the eyes, the trunk, the underbelly. Even if these wounds did not kill the animal outright, they caused pain and panic. A wounded elephant often turned back on its own lines, wreaking havoc on the Carthaginian infantry standing behind it. The Romans realized that the elephant's greatest strength, its size and ferocity, could also be turned into its greatest weakness. Another brutal tactic was psychological warfare against the animals themselves. Trumpets, horns, and even the blaring clash of shields were used to spook the beasts, making them uncontrollable. In some battles, pits were dug and disguised with brush, designed to trap charging elephants in the ground before they reached Roman lines. Against cavalry, Rome deployed spiked caltrops, iron devices meant to maim the elephant's massive feet. Perhaps most importantly, Rome adapted its mindset. The first time soldiers saw elephants, they viewed them as monsters. By the later campaigns, they treated them as just another enemy unit to be neutralized. As Roman discipline hardened, the terror factor diminished. In the end, elephants that once shattered Roman armies at Trebia were far less effective in later encounters. Rome's genius lay not in avoiding defeat, but in learning from it, turning initial panic into seasoned preparation. By the final years of the war, the sight of elephants no longer promised Carthaginian victory. Instead, they had become unpredictable gambles, as likely to trample their own men as to crush Rome. By 2002 BC, the Second Punic War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, faced Rome's rising general Scipio Africanus in North Africa. The two greatest commanders of their age would clash at Zarma, a battle that would decide the fate of Carthage, and once again, elephants would play their part. Hannibal had assembled around 80 of them, hoping to repeat the terror of Trebia and Trasimene.
It was one final gamble to break Roman lines and reclaim the initiative. As the battle began, the elephants were driven forward in a massive charge. Dust filled the air as the ground thundered beneath their feet, tusks gleaming with metal tips, trumpets echoing like thunderclaps across the plain. To Carthage, it was a show of overwhelming force. To Rome, it was a familiar test. This time, Scipio was ready. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for years, and he knew the elephant's weaknesses. Instead of forming a solid wall, Scipio ordered his legions to open corridors in their ranks. At the same time, his trumpeters blared horns to unsettle the beasts. Confused, many elephants veered into the gaps harmlessly, charging through empty lanes before being driven off with javelins. Others, spooked by the noise, turned back in panic, trampling Carthage's own cavalry and sowing chaos in their rear lines. The once feared living tanks became liabilities. Only a handful made contact with Roman soldiers, and even then they were quickly overwhelmed by disciplined spear formations. The rest either bolted or were cut down. What was meant to be Hannibal's opening blow collapsed into disorder before the real fighting even began. Without their elephant shockwave, Carthage lost the psychological edge. The battle turned into a clash of infantry and cavalry, where Scipio's superior tactics and Numidian allies carried the day. Hannibal's army was crushed. Carthage was forced into humiliating peace terms, and the age of Carthaginian elephants effectively ended. At Zama, the war elephant met its reckoning. What had once terrified Rome now symbolized Carthage's desperation. Rome had learned, adapted, and conquered. The beasts that had shaken legions to their core at Trebia and Trasimene could no longer decide the fate of battles. Instead, they became the tragic icons of a fading empire, remembered not for their triumphs, but for their final futile charge. With the defeat at Zama, Carthage's war elephants faded from the battlefield, but their legend endured long after their trumpets fell silent. They had been more than beasts of burden or exotic curiosities. For nearly a century, they were Carthage's most iconic symbol of power, living fortresses that carried both glory and danger into every campaign. The elephant embodied Carthage's strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, they projected dominance. No other Mediterranean power could field such a terrifying weapon with such regularity. Their presence struck fear before a battle even began, and for years Rome trembled at the thought of facing them. On the other, they revealed Carthage's reliance on spectacle. Elephants were unpredictable, expensive to maintain, and devastating when they panicked. At Zama, they showed that Rome's discipline could turn even Carthage's most fearsome weapon into a liability. Still, their impact on history cannot be overstated. The sight of elephants marching across the Alps with Hannibal became one of antiquity's most enduring images. Roman poets, historians, and generals retold the story for centuries, turning those beasts into symbols of audacity and terror. Even after the animals themselves disappeared from Carthaginian battlefields, their memory lived on as cautionary tales about the limits of brute force. Rome itself adopted elephants occasionally, but never with the same devotion. They used captured beasts in triumphal parades and sometimes in battle, but the lesson of Zama remained. Discipline and adaptability mattered more than spectacle. As the empire expanded, elephants became less weapons of war and more emblems of victory, paraded in the arenas for public entertainment rather than unleashed on foreign fields. The Carthaginian elephant, then, occupies a unique place in history. It was both terrifying and flawed, magnificent and impractical. To Carthage, it was a gamble worth taking, an effort to bend nature into a weapon that might offset Rome's rising power. To Rome, it was a challenge that forced innovation, shaping the discipline that would define their legions for centuries. In the end, war elephants did not save Carthage, but they did secure its place in legend. Whenever we think of Hannibal, of Carthage, of the ancient struggle against Rome, the image that rises first is not of infantry or cavalry, but of elephants, colossal, armored, trumpeting in the dust, charging toward destiny.
In the medieval world, bread was not just food. It was the foundation of existence, the one staple that tied together the lives of peasants, clergy, and nobles alike. A man might go days without meat, cheese, or even vegetables, but he could not live without bread. To run out of loaves was to flirt with starvation, and whole communities measured the rhythm of life by the grain harvest, the mill, and the oven. For the poor, bread was often coarse and dark. Rye, barley, and oats were the grains most accessible to peasants, producing loaves that were dense, sour, and sometimes flecked with husks or straw. These black breads filled the stomach but offered little in the way of refinement. In hard times, households stretched their flour with beans, acorns, or even ground-up weeds, an act of desperation that made the bread heavy and bitter. Eating such loaves was a reminder of one's low station, but also of resilience. Even when life offered little else, bread kept bodies working in the fields and children alive through winter. For the wealthy, bread told an entirely different story. Nobles and clergy consumed the finest white loaves, baked from carefully sifted wheat flour. This bread, known as manchite in later centuries, was soft, light, and expensive to produce. To be served white bread at a banquet was as much a symbol of status as wearing silk or owning a war horse. The color itself was a marker of privilege, bright, pure, and far removed from the dark, heavy loaves of the village oven. Bread was also central to ritual. At meals, loaves were often used as trenchers, thick slices that doubled as plates, soaking up meat juices before being eaten or given to the poor as charity. At Mass, bread transformed into the body of Christ, elevating the daily staple into a symbol of divine grace. Thus, from peasant huts to cathedral altars, bread linked survival with spirituality, sustenance with ceremony. Above all, bread carried weight as a political force. A failed harvest or inflated bread prices could spark riots. Lords and kings who failed to provide grain risked rebellion, for to deny bread was to deny life itself. In every crust and crumb lay a truth medieval people knew too well. Bread was not merely something you ate, it was the essence of life, power, and order in the medieval world. For medieval peasants, bread was both comfort and burden. It made up as much as 70 to 80% of their diet, eaten at nearly every meal. Yet the quality of that bread was often far from appetizing. Poor households rarely had steady access to fine wheat flour. Instead, their loaves were made from rye, barley, oats, or a rough mixture of whatever grain the harvest had yielded. The result was bread that was dark, coarse, and heavy, more a block of sustenance than a delicate food. This peasant bread was sour from natural fermentation, baked dense and filling to stretch every grain as far as possible. Because the Lord controlled the mills, villagers were often required to grind their grain there, paying fees for the privilege. Afterward, they baked their loaves in communal ovens, sometimes paying in kind with a portion of the finished bread. The very act of eating, then, was bound up in systems of power and obligation. During lean years, when harvests failed or grain prices soared, peasants had little choice but to stretch their flour with substitutes. Beans, peas, chestnuts, or acorns might be ground in. In times of true desperation, even weeds, ground straw, or powdered bark were added. Such loaves were bitter, hard, and sometimes even dangerous, causing illness if improperly prepared. Yet to go without bread was worse.
So these desperate mixtures became survival food in times of famine. Despite its humble quality, bread was versatile. A crust might be dipped in broth, eaten with cheese, or used to soak up vegetable stews. Leftover bread could be boiled into pottage, or dried and crumbled into other dishes. Even when stale, it still served a purpose. For the poor, nothing was wasted, not a crumb. There was also a symbolic element to bread among the poor. The act of breaking bread at the table, however meager, carried with it a sense of family and community. Sharing a dark loaf in a peasant cottage bound people together as surely as fine wheat bread did at a noble feast. Bread was life, and even the simplest black loaf had dignity in its role. For the medieval poor, bread was both chain and lifeline. It represented their dependence on the land, their obligations to their lords, and the limits of their social status. Yet it was also the daily anchor of existence, a constant presence at the heart of survival. If the poor endured dark, heavy loaves, the wealthy enjoyed bread as a symbol of refinement and privilege. For nobles, clergy, and the merchant elite, the daily loaf was not simply about survival, but about status. The most prized bread was baked from fine, sifted wheat flour, free of husks and impurities. This bread was pale, soft, and delicate, so unlike the coarse, black loaves of the village oven that it might as well have been an entirely different food. Known in later centuries as manched, white bread was costly to produce. Milling wheat finely took time and skill, and the demand for purity meant discarding much of the grain that peasants would never waste. Only those with wealth could afford such extravagance, making the whiteness of bread itself a badge of class. A noble's table groaned with venison, poultry, and spiced sauces, but the gleaming white loaves were just as much a marker of privilege. To be served, this bread was to be reminded of one's place in the social order. At banquets, bread was more than food. It was tableware. Large, thick slices of coarse but decent quality loaves were cut into trenches which doubled as edible plates. Meat, sauce, and gravy soaked into them during the meal. Afterward, trenches might be eaten by the diners or more often collected and distributed as alms to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. In this way, bread connected the excess of the nobility with the hunger of the peasantry.
Bread also played a central role in ritual. At great feasts, loaves might be carved into decorative shapes, stamped with the Lord's seal, or presented in elaborate baskets to display wealth and generosity. In monasteries and cathedral chapters, fine bread was part of daily rations for higher clergy, while lower-ranking brothers ate darker loaves. Even within the church, the quality of one's bread reflected one's rank. To nobles, bread was comfort and symbol alike. It reassured them of their superiority and gave them a chance to display charity by passing leftovers to the needy. But the contrast was stark. While peasants chewed through gritty rye, nobles savored soft white wheat loaves with honey or butter. In every bite lay a reminder of hierarchy. Bread may have been universal in the medieval world, but not all bread was equal. For the wealthy, it was proof that life could be savored, while others merely endured it. If bread was the solid foundation of medieval life, ale was its liquid companion. Morning, noon, and night, it flowed across every social class, from peasant cottages to noble halls. But this was not the potent beer of modern pubs. It was small ale, a mild, low-alcohol brew consumed daily in place of water. In an age when rivers and wells were easily fouled by waste, ale was safer to drink, the brewing process killing off harmful bacteria. To medieval people, it was not indulgence, it was necessity. For peasants,
Small ale was often home brewed, made in simple cottages with whatever grains were available, barley, oats, or rye. The result was a cloudy, earthy drink, weak in strength but rich in calories, providing liquid sustenance for laborers working from dawn to dusk. Children drank it as readily as adults, and it was poured at every meal. A peasant's day might begin with bread and ale, continue with pottage and ale, and end with, you guessed it, more bread and ale. In towns and cities, alehouses became central to daily life. These establishments offered more than drink. They were meeting places, gossip hubs, and makeshift community halls. A penny bought a mug of small ale, affordable even to the working poor. But while ale kept bellies full and quenched thirst, it also provided brief respite from the grind of medieval life. Laughter, song, and camaraderie flowed as freely as the drink itself. The wealthy, too, consumed ale, though of finer quality. Nobles often had dedicated brew houses on their estates, producing stronger, clearer brews, flavored with herbs or even early hops. For them, ale was paired with roasted meats and rich feasts, not just bread and cheese. Yet even in a lord's hall, small ale was the standard drink of servants, squires, and guests alike. Brewing was typically women's work. Known as alewives, women managed the household brewing, selling surpluses to neighbors or markets. Their role in sustaining communities was vital, though often overlooked. Without them, daily life would grind to a halt. For without ale, thirst and disease would quickly follow. Ale was more than drink. It was cultural glue. It nourished and bonded communities and offered comfort across the social spectrum. In every mug, from the rough-hewn wooden cups of peasants to the pewter tankards of knights, lay the same truth. Medieval life ran on bread and ale, the twin pillars of survival. To understand medieval ale, one must step into the smoky kitchens and backroom brewhouses where it was made. Brewing was not yet an industrial process, but a domestic craft overseen primarily by women, known as alewives. They brewed for their families first and for neighbors or markets if there was surplus. In many villages, the skill of a good alewife was as valued as the skill of a good baker, for without her, thirst and sickness loomed. The process began with grain, barley if available, though oats, rye, or wheat could be used. First, the grain was malted, soaked in water, allowed to sprout, then dried in a kiln. This released sugars that could later ferment. The malt was then ground and mixed with hot water to produce a thick, porridge-like mash. From this, brewers drained the sweet liquid known as wort, which held the essence of the ale to be. Boiling came next. In large cauldrons, the wort was simmered with herbs for flavor and preservation. Before hops became widespread in later centuries, brewers relied on mixtures called grit, blends of herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, and juniper. These gave medieval ale a sharp, sometimes medicinal taste, very different from the crisp bitterness we know today. Once boiled, the wort was cooled, then poured into open tubs where natural yeasts in the air sparked fermentation. The result, after a few days, was ale, ready to drink while still fresh and frothy. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was not stored long. It soured quickly, often within days, so it was brewed frequently in small batches. A household might brew several times a week, ensuring a constant supply. Stronger ales could last longer, But the small ale that fueled daily life was meant to be consumed fast before it spoiled. Brewing was not only domestic, but commercial. In towns, alewives sold their brews openly, sometimes marked by signs like a broom or greenery hung over the door. Authorities regulated prices and quality, for bad ale was not just unpleasant, it was a public hazard. A watered-down batch or spoiled brew could cause anger, fines, or even punishment. In the medieval world, brewing was both art and survival. It demanded skill, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. Every cup of ale was the product of human ingenuity, harnessing grain, fire, and fermentation. It was the drink that turned harvests into sustenance and kept medieval society running, one bubbling vat at a time. At every meal in the medieval world, whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, two constants held sway: bread and ale. They were not simply side dishes or accompaniment, but the backbone of daily eating, the reliable staples that framed every bite and sip. For the poor, a meal often began and ended with bread.
A crust of coarse rye or barley loaf was dipped into a bowl of pottage, a thick stew of beans, peas, onions, and whatever scraps of vegetables or meat were available. Ale washed it down, mild enough for children, hearty enough for men laboring from dawn to dusk. It was a diet heavy on sustenance and light on luxury, but it kept people alive and working. In many households, ale was brewed in such small batches that each day's jug was finished by nightfall, leaving nothing wasted. In contrast, noble tables offered bread in a variety of forms. Fine white wheat loaves were set before lords and ladies, while darker breads were reserved for servants and lesser guests. At great feasts, trenches, thick slices of bread, were used as edible plates. These caught the juices of roasted meats and spiced sauces, soaking up flavor until they were eaten at the end of the meal, or collected and distributed to the poor as alms. The presence of multiple bread types at one table visually reinforced the hierarchy of the medieval world. Status was tasted as well as seen. Ale, too, was ever present. In castles, brewhouses produced stronger, clearer ale for the lord's table, sometimes flavored with imported spices or herbs. Servants and soldiers drank small ale, the everyday brew that quenched thirst and nourished bodies. At feasts, great pitchers of ale flowed alongside wine, the latter reserved for the wealthiest or for special occasions. Even so, ale remained the true drink of daily life, trusted over water, and cherished as part of every shared meal. Meals were rarely silent. Bread was broken, ale poured, and conversation flowed with it. Stories, gossip, and even political negotiations conducted over loaves and mugs. In monasteries, silence ruled the refectory. But even there, bread and ale were constants, tying the lives of monks to those of the people beyond their cloisters. At every level of society, bread and ale transformed eating from a simple act of survival into a communal ritual. They were nourishment, but also symbols of labor, privilege, faith, and fellowship. To sit at a table without them would have felt unthinkable, almost unnatural in medieval daily life. Bread and ale were not only the staples of daily life, they also carried deep spiritual meaning in the medieval world. In a society where religion shaped every rhythm of existence, even the most ordinary loaf or jug of ale became symbols of faith, ritual, and divine provision. Bread, above all, held sacred significance. In the Christian liturgy, it was transformed during the Mass into the body of Christ, a miracle that elevated the humble loaf into the centerpiece of worship. Every medieval person,
whether peasant or noble, knew that the bread they ate each day mirrored the bread consecrated at the altar. The words, "Give us this day our daily bread," were not metaphorical. They were as literal as they were spiritual. To go without bread in life was hunger. To go without the sacred bread was eternal peril. Ale, too, though not elevated to the same status, still had its place in religious life. Monasteries were famous for their brewing, providing not only sustenance for monks, but also hospitality for pilgrims and travelers. Within those cloisters, brewing was considered part of holy labor, turning grain into nourishment that supported both body and community. Monks brewed in staggering quantities, producing both small ale for daily consumption and stronger brews for feast days or guests of high rank. Their reputation for purity and quality made monastic ale some of the most trusted in Europe. Fasting practices also reflected the centrality of bread and ale. On days when meat and dairy were forbidden, bread became the primary staple, often eaten with vegetables or fish. Ale remained acceptable, providing calories during long fasts that might otherwise have weakened the body. It blurred the line between food and drink, reinforcing its role as daily fuel, blessed by God's providence. Even beyond church walls, bread and ale were woven into rituals of community and charity. At weddings, loaves and ale were shared to mark fertility and abundance. At funerals, bread and drink were distributed to mourners, binding the living together in grief and remembrance. Feasts in honor of saints often centered on the distribution of bread and ale to the poor, transforming everyday staples into instruments of mercy. In this way, bread and ale were more than nourishment. They were bridges between the earthly and the divine. Every bite of bread, every sip of ale reminded medieval people that their survival was both a gift of labor and the blessing from above, tying the physical act of eating to the eternal drama of faith. For all their centrality, bread and ale were never guaranteed. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or war could transform daily staples into luxuries overnight. In medieval Europe, food shortages were frequent, and when the supply of grain faltered, life grew precarious. Bread, the essence of survival, suddenly became a measure of crisis. The first sign of scarcity was price. In villages and towns, the cost of grain climbed steeply when yields failed. Families who relied on buying flour or loaves soon found themselves priced out of the market. Anger at bakers and millers often followed, as people suspected hoarding or profiteering. Bread riots erupted in bad years, for to deny the people their loaves was to provoke desperation. Authorities sometimes stepped in with price controls, but enforcement was patchy at best. Hunger spread quickly when grain supplies thinned. When flour ran short, peasants turned to substitutes. Rye and barley replaced wheat, producing darker and denser loaves. In dire times, flour was stretched with beans, peas, or chestnuts, which added bulk but little taste. More desperate measures included acorns, ground straw, or even bark. These famine breads were heavy, bitter, and sometimes poisonous if improperly prepared. Accounts from the Middle Ages describe villagers gnawing on loaves so rough they cut the mouth, a cruel reminder that survival came at a price. Ale, too, was vulnerable in famine. Without barley or oats, brewing faltered. Families might water down their ale to make it last, or switch to rough herbal drinks.
In some cases, desperate peasants brewed ale from whatever they could find, fermenting roots, fruits, or even weeds. The result was weak, sour, and often unsafe, but it was better than nothing. Alehouses suffered as much as households, their business collapsing when grain supplies failed. Scarcity also revealed hierarchy. While peasants starved on bark bread,
Nobles often still ate fine wheat loaves imported at great expense. Lords had the wealth to secure supplies. Monasteries hoarded grain for their own communities, and the poor bore the brunt of famine. This inequality could fuel rebellion as hungry villagers turned against the very lords who should have protected them. Famine left scars not only on bodies, but on memory. Generations remembered the bitter taste of substitute bread, the gnawing hunger, and the helplessness of watching stores run dry. Scarcity made clear the fragile balance of medieval life. When bread and ale vanished, so too did stability, reminding everyone that survival depended on the mercy of harvests. Bread and ale were more than food and drink. They were the foundation of medieval existence. From dawn until dusk, they sustained every class of society, shaping not just diets, but economies, rituals, and even politics. Centuries later, their legacy still lingers in our language, our traditions, and the very idea of what it means to share a meal. Bread was the ultimate symbol of life itself. Its centrality is reflected in medieval law and religion, where ensuring grain supplies was a duty of kings and lords. To control bread was to control society, for no one could live without it. Even today, phrases like breadwinner or our daily bread echo its role as the essential measure of sustenance. In the Middle Ages, a man might live on little more than coarse loaves, and a noble might dine on delicate wheat bread, but both understood that without bread, life unraveled. Ale, too, left a mark that endures. It was not the refined, hoppy beer of modern Europe, but a simpler, cloudier drink, more nourishment than indulgence. Its presence in every home, every monastery, and every tavern made it the social glue of the medieval world. Alehouses became centers of gossip, trade, and local politics, while monastic breweries laid the foundation for Europe's later beer culture. The reliance on ale over water reveals a truth about medieval life. Safety, health, and survival were bound up in the brewing kettle. Together, bread and ale shaped medieval identity. They were the common thread linking peasant cottages, noble feasts, and monastic cloisters. They marked the rhythms of life, from the trenchers of banquets to the loaves broken as alms for the poor, from the morning jug of small ale to the sacred bread at Mass. They were not luxuries, but constants, reminders of both human fragility and resilience. When famine struck, their absence tore at the fabric of society. When they were plentiful, they gave stability, even joy. The memory of their scarcity haunted generations, ensuring that grain stores and brewing vats were guarded as fiercely as castles. In the end, the legacy of bread and ale is not just about taste or sustenance. It is about survival, community, and culture. To break bread and share ale was to affirm life itself. In medieval Europe, no act was more universal, no habit more enduring than reaching for a loaf and raising